Hi guys, Sean here from digiDirect. Now today we're going to be looking at the brand new Sony A9. So this has just come out. This is Sony's newest full-frame mirrorless camera, and they've really positioned this as a professional sports camera. And they're trying to have it compete with cameras like the Canon 1DX Mark II and the Nikon D5, which have traditionally been the cameras for professional sports photographers. As such, we'll see that much of the feature set complements this. We're going to see an emphasis on very high-performance autofocus, fast burst shooting, a large buffer, and so on. We're also going to see that reflected in the price tag. This is certainly not an inexpensive camera. It's one of Sony's most expensive, well, the most expensive in their full-frame mirrorless lineup, certainly to date. It's not for the casual user, but it is still less expensive than the 1DX Mark II and the Nikon D5. So we're going to look all into the different facets of the camera, but we'll start with a look at the body. So the Sony A9 is a full-frame mirrorless camera with a 24-megapixel sensor inside of it. The general design of the body is going to look very similar to anyone who's familiar with the A7 lineup, but there are a number of distinct differences here. It's about the same size as those A7 cameras though, which makes it quite small and compact for a camera that's intended to be a professional sports camera. Touching on some of those differences from the A7 lineup though, on the left here we've got a dial that will let you change both your drive mode and your autofocus mode, so you've got immediate access to those changes without having to dive into the menus. That's a very good feature to have on, again, something intended to be a pro sports camera. They've also added a joystick, which is great. If you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know I'm a big fan of joysticks. I really find that they really speed up the operation of the camera, whether that's jumping through menus or changing your autofocus point and so on. And it's a nice solid feeling joystick here as well, so a really nice addition there. I like that a lot. They've also moved that movie record button away from where it was on the A7 cameras. It was kind of off on the side of the grip on those cameras, and it was really frustrating to hit. They put it more close to the viewfinder here, so that's good as well. Generally speaking, the feel of the buttons, they feel a little bit more robust and solid than on the A7 lineup in general. The grip is a little bit bigger, which is nice because you're more likely to be having larger lenses on the front of this camera if you're shooting sports and so on. But if you're coming from those big full-frame DSLRs like the 1DX Mark II and the D5, it's still probably going to feel a little bit small of a grip. And I was shooting much of the sample photos that you'll see in this video with the new 100 to 400 millimeter G Master lens, which is quite a big lens. It is a little bit front heavy still because the camera body is a little bit small to balance those big heavy lenses on the front of them. They've also greatly improved the viewfinder here on the A9 over the A7 range. It's larger, brighter, and sharper. It's really, really nice, a really high quality EVF, which is great. I really enjoyed using it. They've also finally given us dual SD card slots. This was something that was missing on the A7 lineup. They've put it into this, the A9 here, which is excellent because if it's going to be a professional sports camera, you really need those dual SD card slots. One of those is UHS 2 compatible, the other is UHS 1 compatible. Similar to the A7 range, we've got that tilting LCD screen. It is actually a touchscreen on the A9 here, which it wasn't on the A7s. Compared to the 1DX Mark II and the Nikon D5, those both have fixed screens, so that's a bit of a nice advantage having the tilting screen on the A9 here. On the sides, we have an Ethernet port, flash sync port, USB 3, HDMI, and mic and headphone inputs. The camera also has a new battery in it, which is 2.2 times the capacity of the batteries from the A7 lineup. That's a really good improvement because those batteries on the A7 lineup were really getting a bit long in the tooth. They just weren't big enough for those cameras. They just didn't last long enough. This new battery lasts quite a while. It's rated for about 500 shots, but if you're shooting in a high-speed burst mode on the A9, I shot about 3,000 shots before I even hit 50% battery life. So you can really stretch it if you need to, which is a really big improvement over the A7 cameras here. Finally, looking at the actual menu design here, they've added a new My Menu feature, which is a customizable menu. You can slot in a whole bunch of different frequently used options here and access them quickly without digging through the menus. That's very welcome because I've always found that the Sony menus are not super intuitive, so it's nice to be able to plan out and program in the features that you're going to need and not spend too much time digging around in the menus, especially when you pair that with the joystick, which just makes the menu operation faster. Sony does say that the A9 is dust and water resistant. It'll certainly take a little bit of that, although I would personally still be a little bit hesitant to bring it out in full rain conditions, whereas I probably wouldn't be hesitant to do that with like the Canon 1DX Mark II or the Nikon D5. But it is rated for that to a certain extent. So one of the highly touted features on the A9 here is that 20 frames per second burst shooting mode with full autofocus here on it. Now that's not the absolute fastest burst shooting mode we've ever seen. The Olympus EM1 Mark II, for example, can do 60 frames per second, but 20 frames per second is still plenty high, especially with full autofocus here, and it is higher than both the 1DX Mark II and the Nikon D5 can do. Now, when you're shooting at 20 frames per second, you're going to be using the electronic shutter. And in fact, you'll be using the electronic shutter most of the time that you're shooting with the A9 because the mechanical shutter maxes out at 5 frames per second. Now with that in mind, Sony has made some improvements to the electronic shutter so that it doesn't suffer from some of the features that electronic shutters have traditionally suffered from, namely banding and rolling shutter. There certainly is rolling shutter still, it's not eliminated, but they've made it well enough that I don't think anybody is going to have any issue using an electronic shutter versus the mechanical shutter. The fact that it is the electronic shutter also means that you can shoot fully silently, so that's going to be great for event photographers or wedding photographers or anyone who doesn't want to make a lot of noise when they're shooting. Another related highly touted feature here is the lack of any viewfinder blackout when you're shooting with this camera. So again, not something that we've never seen before. The Olympus EM1 Mark II also has this, but if you are coming off of one of those pro level DSLRs, which have mirror blackout as you're shooting, which kind of, gives you that kind of black shots in between shots, this doesn't have that. So it's going to make it a lot easier for you to track your subject, keep them composed correctly, and so on. So a really nice feature to have, especially if you're coming over from a DSLR. The last thing here related to burst shooting is the buffer size. The A9 has a buffer, a very large buffer of 241 raw photos or 362 JPEGs. So if you're shooting at the max speed of 20 frames per second, that's about 12 seconds of raw shooting or 18 seconds of JPEGs, which is quite a bit. You're probably, even if you're shooting action, not going to be sitting there and just holding the shutter button straight for 12 or 18 seconds at 20 frames per second. That's a lot of photos. Now, that's good, but I will mention that if you do fill the buffer, it does take a little while to empty. So I had the Sony's new super fast cards in here and it was okay, but if you have a slightly slower card, or even with these pretty fast cards, it still does take a little while to empty a full buffer, up to even a minute or two sometimes. So while you won't often fill that buffer, you do have to be careful if you do. And you can fill it if you're shooting for maybe 3 or 4 seconds at a time with maybe 1 second break in between and then 3 or 4 seconds again. Because that 1 second is not enough to clear out all the photos that you've just taken. If you do that for a while, you'll find that you've filled the buffer. So a big buffer, you won't often fill it, but if you do, you do suffer a bit of a penalty. So just bear that in mind a little bit. So let's touch on the autofocus here on the A9. So for the past couple of years, Sony's been putting a big emphasis on having fast autofocus systems in all of their cameras, like the A6500, the RX100 Mark V. So it's no surprise that the A9 has a stellar autofocus system inside of it. I have to say, this is the best autofocusing camera I've ever used. So it's got 693 phase detect autofocus points that cover 93% of the frame. So a ton of points with a very wide coverage, and it's just super, super fast, super accurate. The tracking is unbelievable. It's so good at tracking subjects. It is almost exactly right on, like it never mistakes a subject for something else, at least not in my experience. I'm sure it can happen, but it was just so, so good here. Even when you've got subjects coming right at the frame, it stays right with them. I was just super blown away here. And if it does ever occasionally lose focus, it reacquires it very, very quickly. And I'm talking like in the next frame or two often. That's because Sony claims that the camera can recalculate autofocus and auto exposure 60 times a second, which is much faster, obviously, than the 20 frames per second that it can actually shoot at. So it's gonna, if it does lose focus, it's gonna lock up back on really, really quick. Also has really good face detect and eye detect focus, so that's really good for portrait photographers and so on. I really can't overstate how good the autofocus on this camera was. It was just stellar. Like I said, the best autofocusing camera I've ever used. Definitely a big boon for those sports and action photographers because it can really keep up with the kind of stuff that you're going to be shooting. So just excellent marks across the board for autofocus here. Just the best camera I've ever used for this. Keep in mind that the A9 also does have the 5-axis in-body image stabilization that some of the A7 cameras had. This is great. You can chuck any lens on here, whether it's a Sony lens or not, and at least take advantage of that in-body stabilization to keep your shots nice and steady, let you shoot at a lower shutter speed if you're shooting in dark environments. If you do have a Sony lens with image stabilization on it, it'll work together. As I mentioned, I was shooting a lot of the photos with the 100 to 400 G Master lens, which does have image stabilization on the lens as well. That let me shoot even at 400 nice steady shots. So really, really useful. I really like that feature on this camera. Also very handy for video, lets you shoot handheld video a lot easier. Now speaking of video, the camera can shoot 1080p at 120 frames per second. So you can get some nice slow-mo footage out of here, and it's very nice looking sharp 1080p even at 120 frames per second. The autofocus also works really well in this mode. So it does take an extra little minute, a second or two to acquire focus starting off, I found, but once it does, it tracks it quite well, so you can have nice action videos, slow-mo videos, and have the autofocus be right on. In 4K, the camera will shoot 30 frames per second. Would have been nice if they could have done 60 frames per second, but it is what it is. It actually shoots it in the same way that some other Sony cameras have done as well, where it oversamples, so it actually records 6K off the sensor, but then downscales it to 4K. The argument here is that you arguably have a little bit more detail when you do it that way, as opposed to just straight up shooting it in 4K. But there is one big issue with video on the A9, and that's the lack of picture profiles. Sony has made this really seemingly arbitrary and confusing decision to remove any picture profiles from the camera. That means no S-Log picture profiles, nothing to give you that flat picture profile, which is then, preserves a lot more information, which then you can turn around and use to color grade or do some other post-production work really well. You can't do that in the A9. And these are picture profiles that are in almost every other Sony camera, even the RX100 Mark V. So I don't know why they would have not included that in here. I get that they're trying to position this as a sports photography camera, not a videography camera, but there's no reason why they couldn't have put it in here. It would be quite an easy problem to fix just with a firmware update. So I hope they do that in the future. There's been a lot of outcry about the fact that they've made this decision to leave it out. So hopefully they'll take that into account and fix it going forward at one point. But as it is right now, it's really, I don't know, it doesn't make any sense, and it really cripples the camera if you're looking to use it for professional video. So the Sony A9 has clearly been built to fill a specific niche as a small, compact, professional sports photography camera with amazing autofocus performance, high burst shooting with no viewfinder blackout, and a high big buffer. Now, it does have a few stumbles here and there, notably being that lack of picture profiles for the video mode and arguably also the somewhat slow buffer emptying. But overall, the A9 is an extremely impressive camera and a very convincing bid by Sony to try and win over a pro market that's been traditionally dominated by DSLRs. Now, if you want to test out the A9, try out some of that autofocus performance or the burst shooting that I've been talking about, come into one of our stores. We've got them on display. We've got stores in the Sydney CBD, Bondi Junction, Miranda, Chatswood, the Brisbane and Melbourne CBD, and Cannington, Western Australia. You can also order the Sony A9 on our website at www.digidirect.com.au. Thanks, guys. Take care.